Civilization 7 seems to be the birthday present that Sid Meier gave us nearly on his 69th birthday, as the internet is abuzz with news that Firaxis is developing a new mainline Civilization game. And if we take a look through their history, at least the recent history, starting in 2005 with Sid Meier's Civilization 4, 5 years later we had Civ 5, and then of course in 2016 we had the mainline release of Civilization 6, what feels like an eternity ago, and I'm sure it does to you too, Sid. And of course, there were many games in between, like Sid Meier's Beyond Earth, which, granted, didn't release very popular, but did come through eventually with some DLC. And of course, we've speculated for a long time, making up our own Civilization 7 logos and talking about how Civ 7 needs to be different. And we're not alone. The internet is, it seems, abuzz with speculation that the next game will be Civilization 7, and also what Firaxis might do with it, because they have a huge legacy here to build on. In this video, we're going to talk about just that. Let's jump in. And we're going to start by looking at Civ 6's player counts, which I think proves just how popular this game is. Yes, it's not quite at its all-time high peak from its launch, but look at how it's improved consistently over time. And of course with DLC releases, the latest being the Leader Pass, staggering new leaders and content into the game over a 6-month period, just like the new Frontier Pass did the year before. And as a franchise, it proves to be very popular, with Civ 5 still pulling fairly impressive player counts too. So with some new Frontier Pass, nay, Leader Pass gameplay in the background, I'll edit out some slow bits, let's talk about how Civilization can move forward, with Civilization 7 likely being the next release, a main release after many years of waiting. How can the franchise improve? A Civ 7 wishlist of sorts, I suppose, with my personal experience and your feedback taken into account. These are the things on your screen that I think the Civilization franchise could do to move forward, to improve, to revolutionize what it does best, and continue to satisfy us as strategy gamers. So, if you'd like to leave yours below, because of course your comments have absolutely fed into this video, I would be greatly appreciative. Let's jump in. And we're going to start with better maps, which is essentially my first point. It relates to the fifth point, my personal favorite, but we'll get to that slightly later in the video. This one is fairly quick and easy. One of the most common complaints is that the maps in Civilization 6 or 5 just simply don't have the customization we need. Many players would like larger maps, and honestly I tend to agree, although I do personally fancy a nice, tight, small, crammed game of Civilization 6. The second point here around the maps themselves is the fact that they aren't actually a sphere. Now, flat earthers rejoice. Of course, eventually, once you circumnavigate the globe, you realize that it's connected, but we are still playing in a world of hexagonal tiles on a rectangle, and many players would like to see us move towards more of a spherical, circular Earth. I think if we at least had more map options, it would help add to the playability and replayability of a Civilization 7. But for now, I'm going to park that one there, and let's move in to our second point. And here I argue Civilization needs an AI revolution. We need better AI and ideally more customizable options. Let me tell you what I mean. Of course, this comes on a backdrop of Bing, ChatGPT, AI doing everything from copywriting to designing people and fake voices, real voices, all sorts. Yet, they will still send a settler out undefended against you while you're at war. Of course, I'm joking a little bit, but the point here is that there is absolutely room for improvement with AI across the board in all strategy games, of course. I understand it's probably pretty difficult to mimic a human mind, not just for copywriting, but for playing an entire civilization simulator. So credit where credit's due. I don't expect this to be an easy task, but I would like to see, personally, two things. Firstly, more general competence to the AI, an AI that handles situations better, that doesn't send units into foolish places or unlock things it just doesn't need. Secondly, and more importantly for I think player agency and replayability of a future Civilization 7, or whatever the next Civ game to release will be, is that we could actually use with a few more options here as well. Of course, we already have a difficulty slider, but for the most part, and indeed throughout Civilization's history, it has tended to just kind of cheat. Right? The AI starts with more settlers, more cities, more units, maybe it earns money easier, or pays less of a price for unit upkeep. Regardless of how they're doing it, it is essentially just cheating to get ahead. It would be great, of course, not just to have that more competent, but also for us to have more control over individual AIs. Let's say, for example, I want to set up a game where the AI is generally at a fairly comparable difficulty to me. Difficulty 5, difficulty 6, whatever that might be. But I really want England to be overpowered. So I can set their AI to be, next level human, and the rest can just be me on a bad day. Having that level of customization would be fantastic, but to be completely honest with you, everybody, I would be stoked if we just had a slightly more intelligent, more competitive AI move forward. Before jumping into our next one, important to get our YouTube housekeeping out of the way, of course. If you haven't subscribed already, like, blah, blah, blah. Options are there. Next up, let's talk about victory conditions. And here I argue we essentially need more, or at least we need to change the way that we're working some of them. There's a lot of detail that we could go into here. I'm going to keep it somewhat high level. I think the most obvious one is that there is currently no clear way to win an economic victory. Or even at a slightly higher level than that, there isn't an obvious or explicit way that building up to become an economic powerhouse can feed into literally ticking off the requirements for another victory. Now, of course, I'm not saying that a wealthy civ won't be able to win. If you have money, you'll be able to buy things, more units or buildings. But you cannot win the game with gold alone. Civilization 5, of course, we often found ourselves buying city-states with our money, using the diplomatic victory as a pseudo-economic victory. That was one way around it. Civilization 6, and indeed most other strategy games, have ways to feed around this as well. How could Civilization 7 do it, and should it do it at all? I think yes, it probably should and could. Some of the things that it could look at are obviously an explicit economic victory condition. Earn a certain amount of money to win the game. We've seen this play out particularly in some real-time strategy games that come to mind. The other option could be more of a soft approach, adding in more features around the economy that could lead into its own victory condition, or indeed victory conditions of a different type. For example, there could be a mechanic in the game that functions around the reserve currency. If you're unfamiliar, the current reserve currency in real life is the US dollar, has been for decades. But of course, over human history, we've seen many different reserve currencies, the British pound to name but one. So, we could have a reserve currency system where the player or the civilization who has that currency, who is dominant in trade, gets extra rewards. Do they need to win the game because they have the reserve currency? No, but we could use that as a tool to increase their economic dominance. Layer on top things like who's the most powerful trading player. Other buildings or institutions, one-off wonders could feed into this as well. I think you get the idea around how we could shape the economy in Civilization 7, say, to be its own victory condition, or simply just add more features and layers into it so that other victory conditions have more depth to them, more involvement in economy and science, or in economy and culture, to name but two. Let's move on and talk about the next thing on my list, which feeds nicely into, actually, a global political economy, and that is diplomacy and alliances. So there are a few individual things that I could pick at here, but broadly, I think that a lot of players play Civilization 5 and 6, etc., as a single player experience. And so diplomacy, alliances, and of course relating back to how the AI behaves is really important to how we experience the game. Here there are a few specific things I'd like to pull on though, some specific threads that we need to get out. Firstly, at a global level, all Civilization recent games have had some kind of congress, right? Civilization 6 has a global congress that is bureaucratic and very much a gamification of diplomacy, as you might expect. Civilization 5 had, honestly, a somewhat similar system, although of course it played out in a very different way. Sometimes we're relying on votes from city-states, other times we're trying to attract in new allies and new partners. But regardless, I think that we need a Congress system that is intuitive and that works. This will help the late-game diplomacy. We'll talk about the early in a second, but that will help the late-game diplomacy. It should also help to make the late game a little more interesting, right? Another common critique of these kinds of games is that often as you go through, it can become a little bit stale or boring. Back to the diplomacy though, we also, I believe, need better alliances, more features, more trade pacts, more diplomatic pacts as a whole. Here I relate my experience personally a little bit to Humankind, which recently introduced a Congress system. And while it's not my favorite Congress system, it does do a good job to introduce more diplomatic features, pacts that you can have not just with other AI players, but with barbarians or free cities as well. Another way that a future Civilization 7 could look to improve on the diplomacy system, of course, is by adding more to the barbarians. Now, Civ 6 did a wonderful job at adding in new game modes, callbacks to Civ 4 with things like corporations, and of course a whole load of other things, from zombie apocalypses to wastelands, to the economy, to heroes, to barbarians that we can interact with properly. And of course, Civ 7 could look to integrate some of those features to boost up its diplomacy and its alliances system. Finally, and this is a personal one for me, I don't know if it's hugely relatable to everyone else, but I'm gonna put it in here regardless. One of the things that I loved to do in Civ 5 was place down a general as a citadel and steal my opponent's land. It was great. Not just because I like being the a-hole in that situation, but also because it was one of the only ways to transfer land without actually taking a city. Please, Sid, if you're out there, not listening, let me have a way to take land without taking an entire city, potentially having to raise it or raise it as my own, neither of which are very good options. This could be, of course, the option to trade land. It also could move into more of a demands system inside of diplomacy in Civ 7, where we can actually say, hey, if you don't give me that tile, I'm going to go to war with you. Potentially, with an improved AI, that just might work. Speaking of might work, let's move into my personal favorite, number 5, the geography of civilization. Here we need more rich and diverse geography, and let me tell you why. Civilization 6 started to experiment with this a bit more than previous games, with the addition of, say, climate change features, rising waters, and of course, things that we have seen before, like natural disasters. These are all different geographical features or disasters that can play out, not just personally, I find, to add more variance and replayability to the game, but also actually to make the world feel a bit more real. Remember in our first point how we talked about larger, maybe even spherical worlds? Madness! Well, now I want to talk about the specific geography. One of the key ones for me that I have talked about before, so I won't rabbit on about it too long, are rivers. I'd like to see at least some rivers be large, navigable places for military units, trade, or just civilians to build upon. Rivers have been fundamental in human history, from Europe to Africa and almost everywhere else, and I'd love to see them play a more significant role on the map, even if it's just that there are certain units that can navigate along them faster, but I think there's more to do. Maybe we could also look to make some resources depletable or scarce. Resource scarcity is something that hasn't been played with around much in Civilization, and I think leaning into it too far could take away from the magic of Civ. But there is probably some nuance around the edges, even just with a few strategic resources, uranium, coal, or whatever else it may be. Finally, also, I think that we could see some more broader climatic change, and by that I don't mean just rising sea levels, which is great. Humankind experimented a bit with a pollution system which really didn't go down well with players, so there are examples of good and bad systems here. I'm kind of picturing something a little bit like temperature change, glaciation, that kind of thing. A game of Civilization, granted, might only play out from, say, 3 or 4,000 years BC to the modern age, so you're looking at around 600 years of time. I think that's enough time that we could see some dynamic changes to the world's environment beyond what we already see. Here, I would also make a quick note that these kind of features can be best toggled on or off, but they also, of course, need to make sure that the game provides some kind of consistency and perfect balance. There are 3 areas that I think could use extra support, community supports. These are multiplayer, modding, and of course, the obvious one. Now, first up, multiplayer hasn't really worked very well. Lots of people struggle with it. crashing, desyncing. Civ 5, Civ 6, doesn't even actually seem to matter if you're living in the same country as the other people, but if you're not, of course, that makes it even more difficult. I know it's a single player game, largely experienced by lone people at their computer desks, but it would be nice, really, if we had a multiplayer that really worked. The modding scene for Civilization, particularly, of course, Civ 5's Lek mod, Civ 6 has some fantastic gameplay mods still being created, is really strong. Here, I'd like to see more supports offered out to those creative people to do more, better work. And then lastly, of course, I guess overall, the level of community support across platforms could use some work. Most recently, of course, the Leader Pass won't be releasing to consoles until the very end. So while we're getting content every month, you're going to have to wait until the end now. Little things like that I think could shape a better player experience and would definitely make it onto my wish list. Speaking of, I'll leave you with my hot take. Civilization 6 in particular has proven that releases like the Leader Pass and the New Frontier Pass, where they stagger out content relatively cheaply at about $5 a month over 6 months, has been very successful. Not just for player counts, for community interest, but also for sales, and Firaxis have talked about this publicly. I think that moving forward, Civilization could explore a different model, where perhaps even the main base game is released almost for free, and further content is rolled out in that much more gripping New Frontier Pass style. Thanks so much for watching. I'll see you next time.